Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Mark's life was already complicated, but this new chapter was about to turn everything upside down. The next day, Mark found himself back at Brooks' Bistro, the rain still falling softly outside as he walked in, his mind spinning with uncertainty. He spotted Eleanor sitting at the same corner table, her presence as commanding as ever. She didn't look up as he approached, but her eyes flicked to him with a knowing smile. Mark sat down, feeling the weight of his decision from the night before. Eleanor had been right. He was desperate, and this was the only way out. The idea of marrying her for money seemed absurd, but his family's future was hanging by a thread. He had no choice. Or so he thought. Have you made up your mind? Eleanor's voice broke through his thoughts. Her gaze was sharp, expectant. Mark nodded, though a part of him still questioned whether he was making the right decision. His mind flashed back to his mother's medical bills, the calls from creditors, the sinking feeling every time he opened his inbox. It had all led him here. I'll do it, he said, his voice firm, despite the flutter of doubt in his chest. Eleanor's smile softened, just a little, but there was no joy in it. Only a quiet satisfaction, as though this was exactly what she had expected. She leaned forward, sliding a folder across the table toward him. This is the agreement, she said, her tone as calm as ever. You will move in with me and assume the role of my husband in public. You will attend social events, dinners, and family gatherings as my spouse. I'll take care of everything else: your debts, your living expenses, your future. Mark looked down at the contract, the weight of his decision settling even further in his chest. He glanced up at Eleanor, searching her face for any hint of warmth, any sign that this wasn't just a cold, calculated deal. But there was nothing. Just a businesswoman with a plan. What do you expect from me, really? Mark asked, his voice almost a whisper, betraying the uncertainty that still lingered. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I expect nothing, she replied simply. I'm not interested in love, Mark. This is purely transactional. You'll be compensated well, and you'll have the security you've been looking for. Mark couldn't help but wonder if she had ever believed in love, or if her world had always been governed by logic and business. He couldn't imagine what her life had been like, to come to a point where a marriage like this seemed like the only solution. But he had made his decision. There was no turning back now. He signed the contract, his hand steady despite the tremor in his chest. Eleanor watched him, her expression unreadable. Good, she said, her voice cool, but there was a flicker of something else, something that might have been approval. Or perhaps it was just the satisfaction of getting what she wanted. Later that evening, as Mark sat in his small apartment, looking over the papers again, a feeling of unease settled in his stomach. He thought of his mother, of everything he had promised her, and then of Eleanor, this woman who seemed to have everything. Her wealth, her power, and now, the promise of a life that Mark had never imagined for himself. Would he ever fit into her world? Would he ever truly be accepted, or would he always be an outsider, playing a role he didn't belong in? The next morning, Mark moved into Eleanor's mansion. The contrast between their lives was striking. His small, modest apartment had been a far cry from the grandeur of her estate. The marble floors, the towering columns, and the luxurious furnishings left him feeling like a fish out of water. Eleanor showed him to a guest room, a lavish space with an enormous bed and views of the sprawling garden outside. It was everything he had ever dreamed of, yet it felt hollow, like he didn't belong. Mark stood by the window, his thoughts swirling. He had agreed to this, but now, in the quiet of the mansion, he questioned everything. Was this what he wanted? Was this what his mother had sacrificed for? Or was he just another pawn in someone else's game? He didn't know, but he would find out soon enough. That evening, Eleanor hosted a dinner party, introducing Mark as her new husband to a room full of strangers. The people in the room were polished, well-dressed, and every word they spoke was calculated. Mark felt like he was in a different world, one that he didn't understand. But he played his part, smiling, nodding, and pretending to fit in. Eleanor, as always, was composed, watching him with a quiet intensity as they mingled with the guests. Despite the masks they both wore, there was something unspoken between them. Mark could feel it, a connection that neither of them had expected. Was it the shared loneliness, the understanding that they were both trying to fill a void? Or was it something more? Mark didn't know, but he couldn't deny that his thoughts kept drifting back to Eleanor, to the woman who had changed his life in a way he never could have imagined. As the evening came to a close, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes meeting his for the briefest of moments. "We'll make this work," she said softly, almost as if to herself. Mark nodded, his heart heavy with uncertainty. "Yeah, we will." Mark spent the next few days adjusting to his new life. The mansion, with its marble floors and towering columns, felt colder than ever, a constant reminder that he was out of place. Eleanor was as distant as ever, maintaining a strict, businesslike demeanor in their interactions. She kept their conversations professional, focusing only on the logistical details of their arrangement, leaving no room for personal connection. Despite this, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them, something unspoken, but real. At night, he would lie in his enormous bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he had gotten himself into. His life had changed in ways he couldn't have predicted, and yet, as he looked around the lavish room, he still felt like an outsider, a guest in someone else's world. One evening, Eleanor invited him to a charity gala. It was the first real social event they would attend together as a married couple, and Mark felt the weight of his new role more than ever. The guests were an elite group of high-powered businesspeople, their conversations filled with discussions of acquisitions, investments, and global ventures. Mark felt out of his depth, his eyes scanning the room, looking for a familiar face, but finding none. Eleanor, on the other hand, moved through the crowd with ease, greeting everyone with the confidence of someone who had been in this world her entire life. Mark stood at her side, trying to fit in, but every conversation felt like a performance. He smiled when necessary, nodded at the right moments, and kept his answers short and polite. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't help but feel like he was playing a role he didn't know how to act in. Eleanor seemed to glide through the evening, effortlessly charming everyone she spoke to. Mark, however, was left standing in the shadows, wondering if he would ever truly belong here. At some point during the evening, Eleanor turned to him, her voice low and smooth. "You're doing well," she said, her eyes scanning the room as she spoke. "You're fitting in better than I expected." Mark looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. He had expected her to be more critical, to push him harder into this life that didn't feel like his own. Instead, she seemed almost approving, as though he had passed some silent test. "Thanks," Mark replied, his voice unsure. "I'm just trying to keep up." He wasn't sure if he was talking about the socializing, or if he meant it about the entire situation. He had expected to feel more out of place, but there was something about Eleanor's presence, the way she seemed to draw people in, that made it easier to blend in with the crowd. It wasn't comfortable, not by a long shot, but it was manageable. As the night wore on, Mark found himself growing more comfortable with the rhythm of the evening. He spoke with a few guests, made polite small talk, and even managed to impress one of the older businessmen with his knowledge of law, a subject he had studied for years. Eleanor watched him from a distance, her expression unreadable, though there was a slight tilt to her lips that suggested she was pleased with how things were going. After the gala, as they made their way back to the mansion, the car ride was quiet, save for the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Mark couldn't help but think about how strange everything felt. He had come into this marriage with a sense of duty, a need to escape his financial struggles, but as he spent more time with Eleanor, he found himself questioning his motives. Was he just playing a part in her life, or was there something more to this than he had realized? Eleanor, sensing his tension, turned to him. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice soft, almost as if she were trying to reassure him. "You're not the man I thought you were." Mark turned to her, his heart racing a little. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes steady. "When we first met, I thought you were just like the others. Desperate. But tonight, you showed me that you're more than just someone looking for a way out. You're capable, Mark. You could have had your pick of anyone, but you chose to stand by me. For that, I respect you." Mark was taken aback by her words. He had never expected to hear anything like that from her. Eleanor, who had always been so cold, so businesslike, was now offering him something he had never anticipated: respect. And as he looked at her, for the first time since their marriage began, he wondered if there might be something more to their arrangement than either of them had realized. The rest of the ride passed in silence, but for Mark, it felt like the beginning of something new. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but something that might just change everything. The days following the gala felt strange for Mark. He had spent most of his life struggling to get by, but now, as he moved through Eleanor's grand mansion, the contrast between his old life and this new one became even more stark. Eleanor, ever composed, never let her guard down, and neither did he. They existed side by side in the mansion, their roles clear. She was the powerful businesswoman, and he was the husband in name only. But there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when the line between their roles blurred. A smile shared over breakfast, a brief but meaningful conversation about the day ahead, something in her eyes that suggested she was starting to trust Heimer, at least, starting to see him differently. Mark couldn't help but wonder if Eleanor had always been this guarded, or if it was just the result of the arrangement they had entered into. One afternoon, Mark found himself sitting alone in the library, flipping through a book on law. He had never been one to waste time, even in a life that seemed to have everything laid out for him. He was still determined to make something of himself, despite the strange circumstances. His thoughts wandered, though, back to the moments he shared with Eleanor. He couldn't deny that something had shifted between them since the gala. He wasn't sure if it was because they had begun to understand each other better, or if it was just the natural progression of spending so much time together. But there was a tension in the air, something that had been building ever since that night, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his relationship with Eleanor was evolving into something more complicated. The sound of footsteps approached, and Mark looked up to find Eleanor standing in the doorway. She was dressed in a sleek black dress, her hair pulled back in an elegant updo. She looked every bit the part of the powerful CEO she was, but there was something softer in her expression as she looked at him. "I need your help with something," she said, her voice cool but not distant. Mark raised an eyebrow, surprised by her request. Eleanor had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. For her to ask for his help, even with something small, felt unexpected. "What do you need?" Mark asked, setting the book down and giving her his full attention. "I have a meeting tonight with some important clients," Eleanor said, stepping into the room. "I need someone to accompany me, someone who can hold their own in a room full of business elites. You've impressed me at the gala. I think you can do it." Mark hesitated for a moment, still not entirely comfortable with this new life. But Eleanor was offering him something more than just a role to play. She was giving him an opportunity to step into her world in a way he hadn't before. He didn't know if he was ready, but he wasn't about to back down from this challenge. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let fear hold him back now. "I'll do it," Mark said, his voice steady. Eleanor nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I knew you would," she said, turning to leave. But then she paused and looked back at him. "I have to admit, Mark, I didn't expect you to be so adaptable. I was skeptical at first, but now I think I see what you're capable of." Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at her words. Eleanor was not one to offer compliments lightly, and the fact that she had acknowledged his effort meant more than he cared to admit. "Thank you," Mark replied, his voice quiet but sincere. Eleanor gave him a brief nod before disappearing down the hallway. Mark sat there for a moment, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had never expected to be in this position, but here he was helping Eleanor navigate the high-stakes world she lived in. And as much as he tried to resist the growing connection between them, it was becoming harder and harder to deny. That evening, they attended the meeting together, and Mark found himself surrounded by influential businessmen and women. The tension in the room was palpable, and Eleanor commanded attention as soon as she entered, her presence filling the space. Mark stood by her side, trying to blend in, but he couldn't help but feel the eyes of the room on him. He was just a guy in a suit, nothing special, nothing more than a prop in this grand performance. But as the meeting went on, Eleanor would occasionally glance over at him, giving him a look that seemed to say, "You're doing well." It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Mark. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. By the time they left the meeting, Mark's confidence had grown. He had held his own, and Eleanor had taken notice. As they stepped into the car, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes softening for just a moment. "You did well," she said, her voice slow but sincere. "You've earned your place here, Mark." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment he hadn't expected. But as he sat there, in the back of the car, he couldn't help but wonder, was this really just about the money? Or was there something more here, something he was only beginning to understand? The days following the meeting felt different for Mark. He had proven himself, at least in Eleanor's eyes, and now he was starting to feel a shift inside himself. He was no longer just the man who had stumbled into an arranged marriage for financial stability. He was becoming someone else, someone with purpose, with a place in Eleanor's world. The mansion, once a symbol of everything that felt foreign to him, now felt like a space he could move through. He wasn't just an outsider anymore, he was part of something, even if it was complicated. Yet, there was still a distance between them. Eleanor, ever the enigma, continued to keep their relationship strictly professional. They would sit together at dinner, their conversation polite but reserved. Mark tried to push past the walls she had built around herself, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get through. Every time he thought he understood her, she would slip away again, like sand between his fingers. It was late one evening when the tension between them finally broke, in the most unexpected of ways. They were alone in the library, Mark skimming through some legal papers for a project Eleanor had assigned to him. He had started to feel like he was truly contributing, using his skills for something beyond just survival. The fireplace crackled in the background, and for once, the silence between them felt comfortable, not awkward. Then, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was softer than usual, almost vulnerable, as if she had been holding something back. "Mark," she began, her gaze fixed on the fire, "I know you didn't sign up for this. I know you came into this arrangement for a reason, a good one. But I need to ask you something." Mark put down the papers, his full attention now on her. She had never opened up like this before, and he could see that something was bothering her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost unsure of what he was about to hear. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. There was a vulnerability in her gaze that Mark hadn't seen before. She was still Eleanor Brooks, the woman who built an empire, but in this moment, she was just a person, unsure and looking for reassurance. Mark didn't have to think long. He had spent so much time wondering what was real in their relationship, but now he realized the answer was simple. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I don't regret it. Not really." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I'm here, aren't I? And things are better than I thought they'd be. At least, they're not as bad as I feared. And maybe, just maybe, I'm starting to see something in all this. Something that wasn't there before." Eleanor looked at him, the faintest trace of something like hope crossing her features. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other, the weight of their conversation settling around them. Mark wasn't sure what had just happened, but something had shifted. Eleanor was no longer the cold, distant woman he had married for security. She was human, just like him, carrying her own burdens. "I didn't expect you to say that," Eleanor murmured, almost to herself. She glanced away, as though unsure of how to react. But Mark saw the flicker of something in her eyes, something real. For the first time, he saw her vulnerability, and it made him question everything he thought he knew about her. "Maybe you didn't expect a lot of things," Mark replied, his voice light, but his heart was racing. He could feel the tension between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was something else, something unspoken, yet undeniable. Eleanor took a deep breath and stood up, walking toward the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow across her face. She seemed lost in thought, her expression unreadable. "You know, Mark," she began, her voice quieter now, "I've spent so much of my life building this empire, focusing on business, on control. I thought I had everything figured out. But now, I'm not so sure anymore." She turned to face him again, her eyes searching his. "You've made me rethink everything. Not just about this arrangement, but about myself." Mark stood up slowly, unsure of what to say. He had never seen this side of Eleanor before, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. But one thing was clear: things were changing between them. And for the first time, he wasn't sure whether it was just the business arrangement that was evolving, or if something deeper was starting to grow between them. "I never meant to make you doubt yourself," he said softly, stepping toward her. "But maybe we don't need to have everything figured out. Maybe we can just take things one step at a time." He paused, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm here, Eleanor. Not just because of the deal, but because. I don't know, maybe I'm starting to see you in a way I didn't before." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire. And then, Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Mark's heart skip a beat. "Maybe I am, too," she whispered, more to herself than to him, before she turned back to the window, her silhouette framed by the night. The days after that conversation felt different. There was a new, unspoken understanding between Mark and Eleanor, a quiet shift that neither of them had expected but both were beginning to feel. Eleanor remained her composed, professional self, but Mark noticed the small changes: the way her eyes lingered on him a little longer than usual, or how she started to rely on him more for advice and even for company. It was subtle, but it was there. Mark couldn't help but wonder if she was starting to trust him more, or if she had simply come to accept that this arrangement was not just a business deal anymore. For him, it was hard to deny that something more was happening between them, even if neither of them said it aloud. One evening, after a long day of meetings and business calls, Eleanor invited Mark to join her for dinner. It was rare for them to have a quiet meal alone without the pressure of the outside world. Mark arrived at the dining room to find the table set for two, the flickering candlelight casting a soft glow over the elegant space. Eleanor was already seated, her posture perfect, but there was a gentleness in her demeanor tonight. She looked up as he entered and smiled briefly, a gesture that felt more personal than anything she had shown him before. "I thought we could have a quiet evening for once," she said, her voice soft, almost as if she were offering him a rare gift. "No meetings, no distractions." Mark nodded, grateful for the change of pace. He sat down across from her, the warmth of the room in stark contrast to the cold exterior Eleanor often projected. It was moments like this that made him realize how much he had grown to care about her. Despite their marriage being founded on a contract, something real had begun to take root. He wasn't sure if it was love yet, but it was something close. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in the past. They talked about everything from the weather to the most recent project Eleanor was working on. There were no barriers between them tonight, no business talk, no formality. Just two people, sharing a meal and a quiet moment together. Eleanor laughed at one of Mark's jokes, a sound that was so rare from her, it took him by surprise. It was easy to forget that this was the same woman who ran a multi-billion-dollar empire. In this moment, she was just Eleanor. "You've changed a lot since we first met," Eleanor remarked suddenly, her voice thoughtful. Mark looked up, surprised by the shift in the conversation. "You're not the same man who walked into this house. You've become someone I can rely on." Her words were quiet but sincere, and Mark could hear the sincerity in her voice. He hadn't expected this. Eleanor rarely showed vulnerability, but tonight, she had opened up in a way that left him feeling both honored and overwhelmed. "I didn't expect to be here either," Mark said, his voice low, almost reflective. "But I guess life has a funny way of throwing you into things. I didn't know what I was getting into when I agreed to this arrangement," but he hesitated, trying to find the right words. "But it's been more than just about the money. It's been about finding something I never knew I needed. And that something is you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor looked at him, her expression unreadable. Mark could feel the intensity of the moment, and for the first time, he saw a crack in her perfectly controlled facade. She didn't respond immediately, but her eyes softened, just a little. After a beat, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd hear that from you. I didn't expect anyone to get through to me. Not like this." She took a deep breath, her fingers gently tracing the edge of her wine glass. "Mark, I've spent my life building walls around myself. But somewhere along the way, you've broken them down. And I'm not sure what to do with that." Mark's heart raced as he listened to her words. Eleanor had always been the one in control, the one who kept everyone at arm's length, but now, in this moment, she was admitting that she had allowed him in. He didn't know how to respond, but he didn't need to. They didn't need words to understand the shift that had taken place between them. For the rest of the evening, they sat in silence, the only sound in the room the soft clinking of silverware and the crackling of the fire. The connection between them was undeniable, and yet neither of them knew exactly what to make of it. Mark knew one thing for sure: this marriage, which had started as a business arrangement, was becoming something more. And whatever that was, it was something neither of them could control. As the night came to a close, Eleanor stood up, her face once again a mask of composure. "I'm glad we had this time together," she said softly. "Thank you for being here." Mark stood as well, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but in that moment, he felt like they were finally moving towards something real. The next few weeks felt like a blur. Mark's days were filled with meetings, legal work, and events that he had never imagined himself attending. His life, once full of uncertainty and struggle, now seemed to revolve around Eleanor's world. Yet despite the luxury, the power, and the status, Mark still felt a sense of disconnect. Eleanor remained the same, composed, distant, always in control. But something had shifted between them, and Mark couldn't ignore it. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he knew things were no longer as simple as they had once been. One afternoon, Eleanor called him into her office, a rare occurrence that immediately made Mark feel on edge. She was sitting behind her large, polished desk, her fingers lightly tapping on the surface. As he entered, she looked up and gave him a quick, almost imperceptible smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Mark, I need you to handle something for me," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something behind it, something more than business. Mark nodded, waiting for her to continue. He had come to understand her well enough by now to recognize when she was on the edge of something important, but personal. This was one of those moments. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. Eleanor motioned for him to sit across from her. As he did, she handed him a folder, one that looked more personal than professional. "I've been receiving some troubling information," she said, her tone cool but heavy. "There are some people I trust who believe that certain parts of my business are being undermined, possibly from within." Mark's brow furrowed. He had seen Eleanor face countless challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't just a business setback, this was a betrayal. He could tell from her posture, the tightness in her shoulders, that she was genuinely concerned. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, sensing the gravity of the situation. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his, as though trying to measure his response. "I need you to investigate it. I know you're capable, and I trust your judgment," she said. "But there's something else. I need to know if I'm being betrayed, if I'm being misled by someone I've trusted for years." Mark took the folder from her, his mind racing. He had never expected to be involved in something like this, but at the same time, he knew he had to step up. He had already come a long way from the man he had been when he first entered this arrangement, and now, Eleanor was turning to him for help. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't just about the contract they had signed. He was starting to care for her, in ways he hadn't expected. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. Eleanor's eyes softened, just for a moment, before she composed herself again. "I knew you would," she replied. "Thank you, Mark." As Mark left her office, the weight of her trust in him settled heavily on his shoulders. He had no idea who was behind the potential betrayal or how deep it went, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a business issue. This was about something personal, something that could change everything for Eleanor, and for them both. That night, Mark sat at his desk, going through the contents of the folder. The documents inside were more revealing than he expected, showing a web of deceit that stretched through her inner circle. It wasn't just a minor issue, this was a serious threat to her empire. Mark knew he had to act fast, but he also realized that the closer he got to the truth, the more complicated everything would become. He had been thrust into Eleanor's world, but now, he had a stake in its future. As he looked over the documents, he felt a strange sense of resolve. He was no longer just a spectator in Eleanor's life. He was a part of it, and the thought of protecting her, of standing by her through this, brought a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. Mark knew that whatever was coming, he couldn't back out now. This was more than just business. This was about loyalty, trust, and perhaps something deeper, something he wasn't quite ready to define, but something that was starting to take shape between him and Eleanor. The next few days were a whirlwind. Mark threw himself into the investigation, following every lead and scrutinizing every detail. The closer he got to uncovering the truth, the more he realized just how deep the betrayal went. He couldn't understand how someone Eleanor trusted so much could be involved. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Mark found himself more and more entangled in this web of deceit. It wasn't just business Anna-Marie, it felt personal. Eleanor had placed her trust in him, and now he was determined to protect her, no matter the cost. Late one evening, after hours of poring over documents and making phone calls, Mark finally pieced together enough evidence to confront the person responsible. He stood in the study, holding the folder tightly in his hands, his heart racing. He knew that the next step would change everything. If Eleanor found out the truth, it could destroy everything she had worked for. But she deserved to know. He couldn't let her be betrayed by someone she trusted so completely. He took a deep breath and walked across the hall to Eleanor's office. The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminated the room as she sat, her attention focused on the papers in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable, but there was a hint of something, curiosity, perhaps? "Mark," she said, her voice calm. "What's going on? You look like you've uncovered something." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, placing the folder on her desk. "I've been going through everything," he began, his voice steady but filled with tension. "I've found something I think you need to see." Eleanor's gaze hardened, her eyes narrowing as she reached for the folder. Mark watched her closely as she flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing with each new revelation. The silence in the room grew heavy, and Mark's heart pounded in his chest. This was a moment of truth. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you known about this?" she asked, her tone cold. Mark could see the hurt in her eyes, the disbelief that someone she trusted could have been working against her. He knew this wasn't just about business anymore, this was about her life, her legacy, and the people she had let into her world. "I only just found out," Mark said, his voice full of regret. "I wish I could have told you sooner, but I had to be sure. You didn't deserve to be blindsided like this." Eleanor sat back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she held the folder. "I never thought it would be him," she said, her voice breaking. "I trusted him. I thought he was on my side." But now, she trailed off, her gaze distant as she processed the reality of the betrayal. Mark stepped closer to her, his voice softer now. "You don't have to deal with this alone. I'm here, Eleanor. We'll fix this. Together. For a moment, Eleanor didn't say anything. She just stared at the papers in front of her, as if trying to make sense of everything. Then, slowly, she looked up at him. Her eyes were filled with something that Mark couldn't quite place. Vulnerability, maybe? Or perhaps it was trust. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I know one thing: I can't do it without you. Mark's heart clenched at her words. He hadn't expected her to say that, but he was glad she had. He had always known that they were in this together, but hearing her say it out loud changed everything. There was no turning back now. You won't have to, he said, his voice firm. We'll take this one step at a time. And when it's all over, we'll come out of this stronger. I promise. In that moment, Eleanor finally let go of her composure. She reached out, her hand resting on top of his. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. For the first time, Mark could see her not as the powerful businesswoman, but as a woman who had been through a lot, someone who had learned the hard way that trust was a fragile thing. As they stood there, in the quiet of the office, Mark realized that this was the beginning of something new. Not just for Eleanor, but for him as well. They had come this far together, and now they would face whatever came next, side by side. The next few weeks were filled with tension and action. Mark and Eleanor worked together tirelessly to uncover the truth behind the betrayal. The investigation led them down a dangerous path, revealing just how deep the corruption went. They found themselves facing people they had once trusted, people who were willing to sacrifice everything for power. It was a battle not just for Eleanor's business, but for her peace of mind, and for the future they were starting to build together. Through all of it, Mark remained by her side. Eleanor had always been strong, but there was something different about her now. She wasn't the same cold, distant woman who had hired him. She had opened up, allowed him to see her vulnerability, and in return, he had let her in as well. They were no longer just partners in a business arrangement. They had become something more, something they both knew could never be undone. Finally, after weeks of gathering evidence and confronting those involved, they managed to expose the conspiracy. The people responsible were brought to justice, and Eleanor's business was secured once again. It was a victory, but it came with a price. Eleanor had lost people she had considered friends, and Mark had seen a side of the world he never wanted to witness. Yet, through all of it, their connection had only grown stronger. One evening, after everything had settled, Mark and Eleanor sat together in the living room of the mansion. The weight of the past few months was still heavy, but it no longer felt insurmountable. They had faced it together, and now, they were ready to move forward. Eleanor looked over at Mark, her expression softer than it had ever been before. I never thought I'd be here, she said, her voice quiet, but filled with sincerity. I never thought I'd be able to trust someone again. But you, she paused, searching for the right words. You showed me that not everything is about control. That sometimes, it's about letting someone in. Mark looked at her, his heart racing. He had always known that this was more than just a business arrangement, but hearing her say it out loud changed everything. He had never imagined that they would come this far. He had started this journey to escape his own struggles, but somewhere along the way, he had found something he never expected: a family. A home. And most importantly, he had found Eleanor. I'm glad I could be there for you, Mark replied, his voice steady, though his emotions were anything but. And I'm glad you let me in. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. For the first time, Mark saw her not as the formidable CEO, but as a woman who had been through pain and heartache, and who had come out stronger on the other side. I'm glad, too, she whispered. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the promise of a future that they would build together. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Mark knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners, not just in business, but in life. And as he looked at Eleanor, he realized that what they had was something that could not be measured in wealth or power. It was something deeper. Something real. As they sat together, Mark took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. I think we've both come a long way, he said softly. But I'm ready for whatever comes next, as long as we face it together. Eleanor nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. Together, she echoed, and in that moment, Mark knew that this was just the beginning of their journey, one that neither of them had expected, but one that they were both ready to take on. And as the evening faded into night, they sat there, knowing that whatever the future held, they had already built something worth fighting for.